Here is what is confirmed. In the weeks following the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie on February 1st, her family made a decision that families of the missing make when the official investigation moves at a pace that the urgency of their situation cannot accommodate. They hired a private investigator, a professional, someone with the training, the methodology, and the operational independence to pursue lines of inquiry that a federal investigation, bound by its own protocols and legal constraints and evidentiary standards, cannot always pursue at the speed that a family needs. That decision is not unusual. It is not a vote of no confidence in the federal investigation. It is the decision of people who love someone who is missing and who understand that independent investigation, running parallel to the official investigation, can cover ground and develop information through methods and at a pace that the official investigation cannot always match. Private investigators are not law enforcement. They do not operate under the legal constraints that govern federal agents. They can knock on doors that federal agents cannot approach without a warrant. They can have conversations that federal agents cannot initiate without triggering legal obligations. They can move through the informal networks of information that surround a crime and its aftermath in ways that the official investigation, by its nature, cannot. The private investigator hired by Nancy Guthrie's family moved through those networks, knocked on those doors, had those conversations, and found something disturbing. What they found is not the conclusion of an investigation. It is not a forensic certainty. It is not the kind of evidence that walks into a federal courtroom and speaks for itself. It is the kind of finding that a private investigator produces when they follow a thread that the official investigation has not yet publicly reached. The kind of finding that is disturbing not because it is unambiguous, but because of what it suggests about the world that Nancy Guthrie was living in before February 1st, about the people at the edges of her life, about the information that was circulating about her in places and among people that she did not know were paying attention. This is what the private investigator found. This is what it means. And this is what it adds to everything the official investigation has already established about what happened to Nancy Guthrie and who was responsible. Here is who the private investigator is and what that means for the weight of what they found. The family of Nancy Guthrie did not hire an amateur. They hired a professional with documented experience in missing persons cases, in surveillance operations, in the specific methodology that produces actionable intelligence in the context of an active criminal investigation. The private investigator's background, which sources familiar with the family's decision have described in general terms, includes law enforcement experience, the kind of experience that produces not just investigative skill, but investigative judgment, the ability to distinguish between information that is significant and information that is noise, between a finding that deserves to be elevated and a finding that deserves to be set aside. The private investigator elevated what they found. They brought it to the family. The family brought it to the federal investigation. And the federal investigation, which does not typically receive the findings of private investigators without filtering them through its own evidentiary standards, did not set it aside. That is the detail that determines the weight of what the private investigator found. A private investigator's findings are not evidence in a federal case, they are intelligence. They are the starting point for an official investigative thread that the federal team must pursue through its own channels before whatever the private investigator found can enter the official evidentiary record. The federal team's decision not to set aside the private investigator's finding is the determination that what they found is worth pursuing, that it points somewhere, that it adds something to the picture that the official investigation's existing evidence had not yet produced. The federal team is pursuing it. That pursuit is what the finding has produced, and the direction of that pursuit is where the investigation has been redirected in the period following the private investigator's disclosure to the family. Here is the methodology the private investigator used that the official investigation could not. Federal investigations operate within legal constraints that are both their strength and their limitation. Their strength because those constraints produce evidence that survives the scrutiny of a federal court. Their limitation because those constraints establish thresholds, probable cause requirements, warrant applications, formal interview protocols that must be met before certain investigative steps can be taken. A private investigator operates without those thresholds. They can approach a witness and have an informal conversation without triggering the Miranda considerations that govern federal agent contact with potential witnesses. They can examine publicly available information, social media, public records, community networks, without the probable cause requirement that governs federal subpoenas and warrant applications. They can be in a location, a neighborhood, a business, a social setting where information circulates informally, without the visible federal presence that causes people who have information to become suddenly uncertain about whether they should share it. People talk to private investigators in ways they do not always talk to federal agents, not because they are concealing information from law enforcement, but because the informal nature of the contact, the absence of the institutional weight that a federal badge carries, makes the conversation feel less consequential, less permanent, less like something that is going to enter an official record and change their lives. In those informal conversations, information surfaces. Information about what people saw and heard and knew and suspected in the weeks and months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Information about the edges of her life that the people living at those edges have not volunteered to the official investigation, not because they are involved, not because they are protecting anyone, but because no one asked them in a way that made the question feel answerable. The private investigator asked in that way, and the information that surfaced in those conversations produced the finding that the family found disturbing and that the federal investigation found worth pursuing. Here is what the private investigator found at the edges of Nancy Guthrie's life. This is where precision matters, and where the official record has not yet confirmed everything that sources familiar with the finding have allowed to surface. What is confirmed is this: the private investigator, working through the informal networks adjacent to Nancy Guthrie's life, developed information indicating that in the weeks and months before February 1st, Nancy Guthrie had been the subject of attention that she was not aware of. Not the attention documented by the Nest camera visits, not the street-level observation documented by Aldine Meister, not the interior surveillance documented by the hidden camera discovered during the forensic sweep. A different category of attention. Attention that operated through the social and professional infrastructure of her life, through people she knew or knew of, through channels that were not the covert surveillance channels that the official investigation had documented, through a network of observation and information gathering that used Nancy Guthrie's ordinary social existence as its mechanism rather than tunnels and hidden cameras and street-level reconnaissance. Someone had been asking about her, not to her, about her, to people who knew her, to people who were adjacent to her professional life, her social life, the community infrastructure that surrounded her existence in the Catalina foothills. Asking questions that individually seemed innocuous, that were framed in ways that did not immediately register as the intelligence-gathering exercise that the private investigator's analysis suggests they were. But questions that, taken together across the multiple individuals who received them, in the time frame in which they were asked, form a pattern of systematic information gathering about Nancy Guthrie's life, conducted through her social environment by someone who was building a profile of her before February 1st. That pattern is what the private investigator found. And that pattern is disturbing for a reason that goes beyond its connection to the official investigation's documented findings. Here is why a social intelligence gathering operation is more disturbing than the covert surveillance the official investigation has already documented. The hidden camera inside the residence violated Nancy Guthrie's privacy. The street-level surveillance observed her from a distance. The Nest camera visits approached her front door. All of those activities were conducted by people operating at the covert margins of her life. People she did not know. People who were careful not to be seen and not to be known. The social intelligence gathering operation that the private investigator documented is different. It operated through people who were not at the covert margins of Nancy Guthrie's life. It operated through people who were part of her world, who knew her or knew people who knew her, who were embedded in the social and professional fabric of her ordinary existence, who could ask questions about her without raising alarm because the questions came from a context that seemed legitimate, from a person who seemed to have a reason to be curious about her that had nothing to do with planning a crime. That means the people responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie did not only build covert surveillance infrastructure around the physical perimeter of her life. They also penetrated the social perimeter. They used the ordinary social networks through which people share information about each other, casually, without thinking about where that information goes or who it reaches, as an intelligence-gathering instrument. And they did it in a way that Nancy Guthrie's social environment did not recognize as a threat, did not register as something to be concerned about, did not flag as the systematic intelligence-gathering operation that the private investigator's analysis reveals it to have been. That is what is disturbing, not the covert infrastructure. The social penetration, the use of Nancy Guthrie's own world, the people in it, and the information they freely shared about her as a tool in the planning of a crime against her. Here is what the questions that were being asked reveal about the operational objective. Questions asked about a person through their social network are not random. They reflect an operational need. They are shaped by what the people asking them needed to know that the covert surveillance infrastructure was not providing. What the hidden camera and the exterior surveillance and the Nest camera visits could observe, they observed directly. What they could not observe, the information that lives in conversation and social relationship rather than in physical space and visual observation, was gathered through the social network. What do those questions tell investigators about what the operational planning needed? The categories of information most likely to be gathered through social intelligence include financial information. The state of Nancy Guthrie's finances, her assets, her vulnerabilities, her relationships with financial institutions and advisors, is information that neighbors and acquaintances and professional contacts may have partial knowledge of and that cannot be observed through a camera inside a residence. They include relational information: who is close to her, who she trusts, who has access to her life in ways that the operational planning might need to account for or exploit, whether she has people who check on her regularly, whether her absence would be noticed quickly and by whom, whether there are relationships in her life that represent either a risk to the operational plan or an opportunity for it. They include routine information beyond what the hidden camera could observe: where she goes outside the residence, what her schedule looks like across a week or a month rather than across a day or a shift in the camera's coverage, what she does on weekends, where she has dinner, who she sees regularly. The rhythms of a life observed not through a lens, but through the casual knowledge of the people who share her social environment. Each category of information that the social intelligence operation was gathering tells investigators something about what the planning of this crime required that the covert technical surveillance was not providing, and each category narrows the description of who was doing the asking and what they were building toward. Here is what the private investigator's methodology produced that the official investigation could not have produced alone. The private investigator did not find a single source who had all of the information. They found multiple sources, each of whom had a fragment. A neighbor who remembered an unusual conversation weeks before February 1st. A professional contact of Nancy Guthrie's who recalled being asked questions that seemed innocuous at the time, but, in the context of what happened on February 1st, registered as something else entirely. A person adjacent to her social circle who had been approached in a way they described as odd, but had not thought to report. Each fragment individually is ambiguous. Each conversation reported to the private investigator weeks after it occurred is shaped by the knowledge of what happened on February 1st and the natural human tendency to reframe prior events through the lens of subsequent knowledge. The private investigator understood this and weighted each account accordingly, applied the analytical discipline that their professional experience provides to distinguish between the fragments that reflected genuine pre-February 1st observations and the fragments that reflected post-disappearance reinterpretation. What remained after that filtering was a pattern, Multiple independent sources, approached by the private investigator through multiple independent channels, had each experienced a version of the same thing. An approach, a question, a conversation about Nancy Guthrie that came from outside her ordinary social network and that was seeking information about her life that went slightly beyond what casual curiosity would require. That pattern, documented by the private investigator across multiple independent sources, is what converted individual ambiguous fragments into a finding significant enough to bring to the family and from the family to the federal investigation. The pattern is the finding, and the pattern is disturbing. Here is what the person asking the questions looked like to the sources who received them. This is where the private investigator's finding adds a dimension to the investigation that the official evidentiary record has not yet fully captured. The sources approached by the private investigator describe the person asking questions about Nancy Guthrie in terms that do not, in every case, match the description of the individual documented by the Nest camera footage and the Aldine Meister sighting and the composite identification. That discrepancy is operationally significant. If the person conducting social intelligence gathering was a different individual from the person conducting exterior physical surveillance, the network of individuals involved in planning this crime is larger than the exterior surveillance record alone established. The composite identified the person at the physical perimeter of the crime. The social intelligence operation points towards someone operating at the social perimeter. Two different people performing two different intelligence gathering functions within the same operational structure. That structure is the structure that the 19-hour interrogation disclosure described. A coordinated operation with differentiated roles assigned to different individuals. The tunnel builder, the surveillance operator, the coordinator, the person responsible for the secondary location, and now, through the private investigator's finding, potentially, the person responsible for social intelligence. The person who penetrated Nancy Guthrie's social world and gathered from it the information that the technical surveillance infrastructure could not provide. That person has not been officially identified. Their description, as provided by the sources who encountered them in the weeks before February 1st, has been turned over to the federal investigation. Whether that description matches any individual already in the investigation's field of view, or whether it introduces a new actor into the documented network, has not been officially confirmed. Verification needed on whether the description of the individual conducting social intelligence gathering, as developed by the private investigator through source interviews, has been officially matched against any individual already identified in connection with the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Here is what the private investigator found that was most disturbing. Beyond the pattern of social intelligence gathering, beyond the questions asked about Nancy Guthrie through her social environment, beyond the implication of a coordinated operation with differentiated roles that the pattern suggests, the private investigator found something specific, something that the source who provided it did not fully understand the significance of until the private investigator placed it in the context of everything else the investigation has documented. A conversation, a specific conversation, reported to the private investigator by a source whose credibility the private investigator assessed and found sufficient to elevate the account. A conversation that occurred in the weeks before February 1st between the source and an individual the source could not identify with certainty, but whose description was sufficiently specific to be operationally useful. In that conversation, something was said about Nancy Guthrie. Something that, at the time it was said, the source processed as odd but not alarming. Something that did not register as a threat or as evidence of criminal planning. Something that entered the source's memory as a strange exchange and remained there without being acted upon until the private investigator's questions provided the context that transformed it from a strange exchange into a disturbing one. What was said in that conversation has not been officially confirmed by any law enforcement source. What sources familiar with the private investigator's findings have indicated is that the content of the conversation reflected prior knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's circumstances, vulnerabilities, or situation that the person speaking should not have had unless they were either significantly closer to her life than the social context of the conversation suggested, or were receiving information about her from a source with closer access. That prior knowledge is the most disturbing element of the private investigator's finding, because it means the people responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie knew things about her that they should not have known, things that were not visible from the street or from a camera inside the residence, things that lived in the private dimensions of her life that only people close to her would have access to. Someone close to her life was providing information to people who were planning to take her. That is what the conversation suggests. That is what the private investigator's finding points toward. And that is what the federal investigation is now pursuing through the official channels that can turn a private investigator's intelligence into federal evidentiary record.